Alright, hello class, and welcome to this introductory video to the conflict in North Korea. This is your professor, Brant Ellsworth, and today my hope is to provide again this background to give you an overview of the Korean conflict, to provide some context as to where the Korean people came from, what are their origins, how did North and South Korea divide, how did Ilsung come into power, and how did his family remain power throughout the latter half of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Now, I imagine many of you, if you were asked to choose to find Korea on the map, would struggle. That was my experience, certainly. When I was 19 years old, I found out that I would be moving to Seoul, South Korea. I had heard of it, but I had no idea where it was. So if you were like me, let me show you on the map where the Koreas are located. Broadly, on the big map, here it is. The Korea is a peninsula located just south of this section of China, and to the south of Russia. It is to the west of Japan, which is the island located here, a series of islands located to its east. The capital of South Korea is Seoul, which is located here. And the capital of North Korea is Pyongyang, which is located here. As you can see, it is a peninsula, and because of its shape, and because of the heavy mountain regions that are located up here in the North Korea-Chinese borders, the Korean people have largely been an isolated people throughout much of its history. This peninsula has been inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years, dating back thousands of years BCE. But because of its location, the peoples of the Korean peninsula were heavily influenced by the more advanced, more powerful, and more violent neighbors, especially China and Japan. The Korean language was heavily influenced by Chinese, and the Korean people, their customs, their manners, their beliefs were heavily influenced by both Confucianism and Buddhism. Alright, so the Korean people are often, in terms of history, are divided into three major dynasties. Now, we won't go into detail about the three, but I'll begin with the third dynasty, which is known as the Joseon dynasty, which dates from about 1392, so the end of the 14th century, through the end of the 19th century, so to about 1897. During this period, the Korean peninsula was controlled by a man named King Sejong, which is this man right here, Sejong, who is an important leader. And today, Koreans continue to hail this man as a significant leader in the formation of the Korean people. In fact, their currency, the won, features an image of King Sejong. He is like the George Washington of Korea. King Sejong will rule from about 1397 through about 1450. And during this period, Sejong will establish some really important reforms. He will establish royal authority, and he will help to establish the Korean language known as Hangul. Now, for those of you interested, I'm not sure how many of you are, the Korean people themselves are a descendant of China, and as I mentioned, the Chinese language was significant, and this early Korean people spoke a reformed Chinese. But with King Sejong, he decided to create a new alphabet and use that alphabet to help create a new language, which today is known as Korean. For those of you, I'll just go ahead and show you. The Korean alphabet, and it is an alphabet, is actually quite simple. So if you look here at this writing, this is a representation of the Korean alphabet. It reads Sejong De Hwang, which translated means Sejong, which is the this king's name. Dae means great and Wang means king. Now the only reason I can read this is because in living in Korea, I learned the alphabet. I learned how to read in Korean. And it's actually quite simple. In fact, it is far more easy to read correctly Korean than it is to read English. Because, as you know, English has a variety of rules. If you see an A, it could be a short A, it can be a long A. And there's so many rules and exceptions to rules that makes English one of the hardest languages to learn. This is not true for Korean. While it is not an easy language to learn, it is an easy language to understand and master the alphabet. The language itself is made up of a series of vowels and consonants. I can't recall the number, but say this word right here, Sejong, is a mixture of syllables, is a mixture of consonants and vowels. Each of these sets, and there's 4 of them, constitutes a syllable. Sejong de Huang. And each of these symbols has a very specific sound. There's only one sound per character. So if you want to break this up, this letter, though in this formal writing it's written more like this, but today you'll see it written more like this. This is an S sound. So anytime you see this, you'll know that it's an S sound. And then this is the vowel, making it a S-A. Say. This is a like a J or a G, a blend between the two. J is a consonant with a vowel underneath it. This is a O, and underneath it you'll see an NG. So this is a J, ong. So Zhong, say, Zhong. D, this is a D with another vowel, an A, day, and then a vowel sound. These combined make a hua, like a hua, and another NG, very similar to this one. So say, Zhong, de Huang. And just like that, you can read in Korean. So there are a variety of consonants. So I'll write syllables: ka, na, da, ma, ba, pa, ra, etc. And there's a variety of vowels. So there's ah and aw and o. Oh, what is that one? A and yay and o and yo and oo and you, etc. Oh, forgot E. Here's the E sound. All right, so probably more than you really care, but so this is King Sejong, influential leader, helps to establish the Korean language. Now he will die in around 1450, and his children will become heirs, will become kings and queens. And the Joseon dynasty in Korean is known for its isolationist approach to international relations. This is considered the Hermit dynasty. So these people try to stay away from the more powerful Chinese and the more powerful Japanese. But even though they had this isolationist approach, it did not keep foreign invaders from entering their lands and trying to start wars with them and overpowering them. And so, for instance, the Japanese would wage a variety of wars against the Korean people during the 15th and 16th centuries. As time progressed, we also see the rise and the spread of Western civilization. And so, for instance, the British will spread. You'll see the British traveling into the Koreas, into China, hoping to establish trade routes with these people. but the Koreans really had no interest in engaging with these outsiders. Nonetheless, they were forced to sign treaties with these foreign powers, and these treaties, because of the Koreans' lack of technological progress, many of these nations took advantage of the weaker Korean people. At the tail end of the Joseon dynasty, so at the end of the 19th century, we will see a rise in assassinations and other political unrest. We will see rebellions, and eventually we'll see the Joseon dynasty will topple, and in its place, the Korean Empire will form. Now, the Korean Empire will only last a handful of years, from 1897 through about 1910. And the reason why the Korean Empire would end so quickly is because, turn this off so I can type, is because of the imperialistic motives of neighboring Japan. Japanese invasion of Korea. So in 1910, neighboring Japan waged a war on Korea, in which imperialistic Japan will overcome Korea. They will annex Korea and force the assimilation of the Korean people. By this I mean that the Japanese tried to swallow up the Korean people and their customs, their religion, and their language. It became illegal for the Koreans to write in Korean, to speak Korean, to worship in the Korean religions, to honor the Korean dead. Instead, the Koreans were forced to become Japanese, to support imperialistic Japan as it continued to wage wars in places like China, and as it entered into World War II at the end of 1939 and in the early 1940s. Koreans were forced into forms of slavery. Women and girls were sold into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. Japanese men were forced to enlist into the Japanese military and fight for Japan. Those who were old or too young were forced to work in factories or work the fields to harvest food to feed the Japanese soldiers. And so for a period of about 35 years, from 1910 to the end of World War II, as you can tell, the Koreans lived a really poor existence. At the end of World War II, pull up another map of Korea. At the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union will tag team, and as they seek to push to control Japan and to limit its realm of influence, the Soviet Union will march tanks down through Russia and through parts of China into the North Korean area, so the northern half of the Korean peninsula. Shortly thereafter, the United States will come in with its own, with the Marines and the Army, and come into South Korea. And so at this time, when Japan signs the treaty, North Korea has Soviet Union tanks, and South Korea, what will become known as South Korea, has the United States military. And so as a treaty is signed, the Soviet Union and the United States both agree to split the Korean peninsula, and they would do so here along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union controlling the area which is deemed to be the north, and the United States controlling that area which is to the south. And so this is around 1945. We have both North Korea and South Korea. We have the Soviet Union and the United States. And as you can imagine, after World War II, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States continue to escalate in what is known as the Cold War, both countries will have a vested interest in the well-being and what will become of the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Union supporting communism and the increase of a communist government, and the United States favoring republics, establishing democracies, and spreading capitalism into the South. Now, let me provide a little bit of background background now to a man named Kim Il-sung. This man, Kim Il-sung, is the grandfather of current North Korean President Kim Jong-sun. Kim Il-sung was born during the Japanese invasion of Korea. He was a young man, a teenager. And so at this very early age, seeing the military march into his village, Kim Il-sung would escape, and he would move up into the Soviet Union, where he would fight as a member of the Red Army, and he would fight against the Japanese. He lived in the Soviet Union, he trained in the Soviet Union, he became indoctrinated with communism. And so, as this military guerrilla hero, Kim Il-sung becomes a folk hero among the North Korean people. At the same time, a rival named Cho Man-sik would gain the support of the North Koreans. So at this time, as North Korea is trying to establish a sense of government, of control, we have two competing forces: those who support Kim Il-sung, who is this military, this rebel, this guerrilla fighter, versus a little bit more controlled and diplomatic Cho Man-sik. Ultimately, Kim Il-sung will gain the support of the communists. He will help to establish a Workers' Party of North Korea, in which he will rise up to become the chairman of it. And so, as a communist leader in North Korea, in the mid-1940s, Kim Il-sung will become North Korea's first premier, their first president. But it isn't as easy as that. As I've mentioned, both the United States and the Soviet Union were very invested in this country. The United Nations in 1948 tried to organize both North and South Korea under the banner of the Republic of Korea, hoping to establish a national legal government and have open elections. However, Kim Il-sung and the Soviet Union were opposed to that idea, and instead of establishing a democracy or allowing Kim Il-sung to run for president, they instead elected to instill communism, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formed with Kim Il-sung as the premier. For the next 5 years, North and South Korea, with its American and Soviet Union backing, will live with tension. The communists, of course, wanted control of the entire Korean peninsula. The American-backed Democratic side wanted control of the entire peninsula. But nothing was done until 1950. And in 1950, North Korea breached the 38th parallel and invaded the South. Kim had the backing of China's Mao Zedong and the blessing of Stalin in the Soviet Union. And so in 1950, North Korea crossed that boundary, marched in, and captured Seoul. And this action began what is known today as the Korean War. The Korean War, which becomes one of many areas in which the United States will wage war in the second half of the 20th century, hoping to curb the spread of communism. It was believed that communism would ultimately prove to be the enemy to America, to the spread of American ideals and democracy. And so, as the Soviet Union-backed North Korean troops invade South Korea, the United States decide to support the South Koreans, to put troops on the ground, and to help push back the North Koreans. And so that's exactly what happens. Famously, General MacArthur will land in Incheon, and the United States soldiers supporting the South Korean soldiers will push back against the North Koreans and essentially push the North Koreans all the way back and push them until and this is where it gets fascinating, until the Chinese president Mao Zedong will now send his Chinese troops across the North Korean border to help back up the North Korean troops. And so here in the Korean War, we see the South Koreans fighting the North Koreans, but with the United States also fighting against the Chinese. And so today, here we are 60, almost 70 years later. You know, America has this history of engaging in military actions, and we have fought militarily against Chinese soldiers in the last century. The war will continue until 1953, at which point the North and South Koreans will sign an armistice. Now, through this armistice, a line was drawn along the 38th parallel, dividing South and North Korea. This area, which is known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, still exists today. Now, many people who are aware of this armistice will note that technically the war between North and South Korea did not end. Instead, an armistice was signed, which is a temporary peace agreement. But both North and South Korea have reiterated that there is still a war being waged between the two countries. And so today, as North Korea continues to flex its military might, creating missiles and firing these missiles, there have been tensions between these countries, and these tensions have escalated in recent years. When I lived in Korea about 15 years ago now, I remember there was a South Korean a ship which had ventured past the 38th parallel, which the North Koreans blew up and I guess sank. I know there's instances where North Korea's soldiers will swim through the Sea of Japan and land on the other side of South Korea and kind of go Rambo and shoot at people. In addition, I know there are constantly guns being fired through the DMZ between North and South Korea. All right, after the war, South Korea received cash infusions from the United States. The United States has remained invested in South Korea. There are still military bases, and there are still American soldiers who are there in South Korea helping to protect. And the United States has become close allies with South Korea. In the North, the 15 years or so after the end of the Korean War, the North Korea government economy tinkered on the brink of collapse. If it weren't for the support of the Chinese and the Russians, or the Soviet Union, North Korea would have collapsed during that time. President Kim Il-sung worked a variety of ways to help bring about economic prosperity for his people, but relatively had very little success. In the 1950s, President Kim established the idea or the philosophy that is known as Juche. Spelled like this, Juche, or in Korean written like this, Juche. Juche, which is translated to mean self-reliance, especially through military power. This became the official mantra of the North Korean peninsula: self-reliance, provide for yourself. But the 1950s showed that being self-reliant hinged upon more things than just military power. The military power does not put food on the table. And so the controlling power in North Korea, the high class, had an insatiable appetite for niceties, for wealth. And so this topped 20% of the population lived in extreme, lavish conditions, while the bottom 30% lived in extreme poverty. Korea is prone to famine, and as we will see in future decades, hundreds of thousands, if not more, people will die because of this famine. There's this. Then, as time passes, the North Korean Kim Il-sung maintains power at all costs. He accepts loans accepts payment, takes out loans, will accept food rations from other countries to help support his people. But perhaps the most important thing was in 1991 the Soviet Union will dissolve. And with that, the North Koreans' closest ally suddenly disappears. Also, the Chinese begin to adapt more of a capitalistic, while their politics remains communistic, their economics has become more capitalistic. And with that, suddenly North Korea began to feel more and more isolated. In the early 1990s, instead of paying back its international loans, North Korea chose to default on those loans and instead decided to put its money into its military and continue to spend lavishly in its top class. Right? Those decisions will have huge ramifications. There is no doubt that by this point in the early 1990s, South Korea economically had so far surpassed North Korea that I'm sure there was some envy among the North Koreans, that perhaps many began to see that this North Korean experiment in communism was failing. Those who offered up a voice that was critical of Kim Il-sung would find themselves being sent to political prisons or executed. In 1994, President Kim Il-sung will die, and his son, Kim Jong-il, will assume the presidency. And this point happens at the same time that a widespread famine will hit North Korea, which will last for 3 to 4 years, during which time it's estimated that somewhere between 600 and 900,000 North Koreans will die. Some reports put that number as high as 3 or 4 million will die of malnutrition or starvation. In addition, an entire generation of children will forever be impacted by the physical ramifications of malnutrition. But instead of dissolving the nation's communist background, Kim Jong-il will decide to double down. He will seek to establish military power by removing anyone who posed a threat, and by using all their money to expand its military. In North Korea, all men are expected to serve in the military. And in 1998, this policy will become official with the policy known as the Sungun, which stands for military first. Military first. And what we see today coming out of North Korea is largely this type of policy. Military first, military power first. All right. Fast forwarding to 2011, Kim Jong-il will die, and his son, Kim Jong-un, will take over the reins as the third premier of North Korea. Kim Jong-un will be educated in the United Kingdom and would be actually living in England at the time of his father's death. Kim Jong-un will return to North Korea and, much like his father did, will seek to consolidate power by really stressing military power. And what we've seen from Kim Jong-un over the last few years is this idea of not just expanding the military, but also expanding North Korea's missile power, its nuclear ambitions. And so we have seen numerous nuclear weapon tests, as well as North Korea spending its money in expanding the range of its missile program. In addition, North Korea has expanded its use of in technology and internet as a way of hacking into foreign governments and being a pain in the rear to other countries. Actually, just today, the day that I'm recording this, the State Department declared that the North Koreans were responsible for a malware attack that occurred last year called the WannaCry mal attack. So this is something that clearly the North Koreans are doing. They are engaged, not taking care necessarily of the economic for its people, but Kim Jong-un recognizes that, looking at the toppled regime of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, that as these leaders give up their military power, they give up their missile programs, is a time that they are disposed of by the Americans. And so it seems that in an attempt to keep control, Kim Jong-un is doubling down and seeking to pose a threat to the United States. So that is where we are today. The background of this, that the Korean people have long been at odds with each other. They have often been picked on by neighboring Chinese and by Japanese. That there has been war fought there, and that even though over the last 60 years, especially South Korea has seen a rapid increase in its economic powers, there continues to be tensions between North and South, and between North Korea and the United States. Now, that conflict, as we will look at in the readings for this week, takes on many different forms, and many people argue that Kim Jong-un isn't some crazy rocket man, as President Trump labels him, but that this is actually very shrewd and calculated move as a way of making the United States step down, and it's a great way of ensuring the continuation of his power. Well, class, this is the end of this video. I don't know how helpful this was. I hope it was informative, that it was interesting. I know I have a way of droning on, but I hope that this provides you a good sense of background as to what is happening, or what has happened in North Korea for the past 150 years, to provide us some sense of why North Korea is acting out in the way that it is. This is it for this video. I look forward to seeing you guys in the discussion board and seeing your responses to this week's assignments. Signing off, this is your Professor Brant Ellsworth. Farewell.